Okay, I know you just got here, but John, would you mind opening us up in a word of prayer? Thank you. Amen. Thank you. Okay, so where are we? I'm supposed to know, right? We've been studying Matthew 26, which is a really long chapter. Sometimes the people who divided the Bible into chapters, I wonder at some of their logic. Because you have some short chapters and then some long chapters. Some chapters have like 15 verses. Other chapters have 80. And when there's an easily visible division, but anyway, this is a long chapter, so we're still studying Matthew 26. And the last couple of lessons, we studied the Last Supper and the First Communion, and we saw how Jesus warned his disciples that they would all scatter when he was arrested. And then, of course, when Jesus says that, who speaks up? Loudmouth Peter. The big mouth, right? And he's boasting that not only would he not abandon Jesus, but he would go to the death with Jesus. And then, of course, he's so passionate about it that all the other disciples jump in. It's like you see oftentimes at some kind of a rally or something, one person speaks up really loudly and passionately. Because they're doing that, everybody jumps in. Whether they really mean it or not, everybody just gets excited and jumps on in. Because obviously the disciples didn't really mean it, because we see later when it comes down to it, they don't follow through. And that's the danger of that kind of an emotional reaction. So then after that, Jesus takes his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he tells 8 of the disciples to wait for him at the entrance to the garden, and takes 3 with him as he heads deeper in. Does anyone remember which 3 he brings with him deeper into the garden? His core 3. Peter, James, and John. It's always Peter, James, and John at the Mount of Transfiguration. When he raised Jairus' daughter, he brought Peter, James, and John with him into the room and left the others out in the common room. And then Jesus gives Peter, James, and John instructions before he goes even deeper into the garden. Does anyone remember what his instructions were? They were to tarry or wait and watch with him. To stand guard, not stand guard against anyone coming to attack, but to stand guard spiritually in prayer. Because then later he tells them that they're praying not just for him, but that they would not enter into temptation as well. And do they follow his instructions? Nope, they fall asleep. So while Jesus is praying and pouring his heart out to the Father, his disciples are sleeping. So like I said last week, just like Jesus fell down on his face to pray, his disciples also probably fell down on their faces, but not in prayer. They fell asleep. So when Jesus wakes them, then he tells them that one of the reasons they should have been praying is for themselves, that they enter not into temptation. And now we're going to try to finish up that part of the story. We're going to go to Matthew 26, and we're going to read verses 42 through 46. And they say at verse 42, he went away again the second time and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them and went away again and prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then cometh he to his disciples and saith unto them, Sleep on now and take your rest. Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. Behold, he is at hand that doth betray me. So now we see Jesus goes back to where he prayed his first prayer. So he came out, found the disciples sleeping, wakes them up, says, you need to be praying. He goes back and prays again. Now notice his prayer here is slightly different. He still starts with, "Oh, my Father," that relationship. It's not just God, it's Father. It's, like I said last week, when your kid comes and asks you for something, they don't come with a formal voice. They come saying, "Daddy" or "Mommy, I want this." It's because they're bonding with you. And in the same way, Jesus and God the Father are one. So he still starts with, "Oh, my Father," yet now he isn't asking for the cup to be removed. You notice that. In the first, he says, "If there's any way this cup could be removed." And then here, he just says, where was I? Here we go. "If this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done." So he is fully submitting to the Father's will for the redemption of man. He's saying, if there really is no other way, I realize that there is no other way here. The only way is for me to be made sin. The sinless God, he has never sinned. And he actually, the Bible tells us he's made sin. He becomes our sin so that God can pour his wrath on him, and he pays the price. He takes the wrath and the punishment for our sin so that we can be forgiven. And so there's full submission here in that prayer. It's no longer, is there any way for this to be avoided? It's, I know this is the only way, and I'm willing to go through with it. And then when he returns, what are the disciples doing? They're praying this time, right? Nope, they're sleeping again. And the Bible says, "For their eyes were heavy." Now, some believe Matthew includes this phrase here to show they may have been trying to stay awake, yet were so exhausted from all the recent events, they've had a big day, okay? And they've had a really big day, and now Jesus says, "Stay awake and pray," and it's at nighttime, and it's after dinner time. What do you want to do after a big dinner? You want to take a nap, right? Or just go to bed and sleep till the next morning. And so he says their eyes were heavy. That's why they couldn't stay awake. Some believe it's just that they were so exhausted. There are also some who believe that this may be an indication of a spiritual influence from Satan to keep them from praying with Jesus. He may have caused their eyes to be heavy. And that would leave Jesus alone in agony. Now, whether it was a spiritual influence or that they were just exhausted, the fact remains they did not have the willpower to pray with Jesus in his time of need. Because either of those things could have been fought. The exhaustion, with the knowing who Jesus is, because they said he's the Messiah. They've said he's God. So they've acknowledged it. So they should have been able to fight either of those things, the exhaustion or an influence. Now, you notice here, in the first time he comes back, he wakes them and gives them instructions saying, pray that you enter not into temptation. Here we don't know if he actually wakes them or not, because it does not indicate that he wakes them. But he does go and pray again. And now Matthew just tells us that he prays the same words as he did earlier. And that would be the same words he prayed the second time, right? Because that was the time preceding this one. He's not going back to the first prayer where he says, "Lord, if this can be avoided, my Father, if this can be avoided, that's what I would really prefer." He's going back to the submission of, I know this is the only way, and I'm going to do it because that's God's will. Now notice here, Jesus prays for practically the same thing multiple times in one night. Some people would have you believe that if you have enough faith, you should be able to mention something to God once, and see it answered. That if you have to pray for it multiple times, some people believe that's a lack of faith. That's obviously not true, because then Jesus would have had a lack of faith here in the garden. And Jesus, being perfect, would not have a lack of faith. So it's not a lack of faith if you pray multiple times. There are places, actually we've read them in Matthew, where Jesus encourages us to pray fervently. So Jesus here demonstrates fervent prayer as we see him repeating basically the same request 3 times. Praying for, just pouring his heart out, knowing that he has to go to the cross. And then he comes back and he wakes his disciples and he tells them, now that everything is settled, it's the time to get some rest because the hour of his betrayal to sinners is at hand. Jesus knew, even before he sent Judas to set up the betrayal, that it would happen here at Gethsemane. So he knew when he brought the disciples there that Judas would be there. Even a normal person would have been able to suspect that that's where Judas was going to show up, because John tells us that Judas knew this place as being a place where Jesus would come to pray. So Jesus could easily, even as a normal person, have suspected Judas would come there, but Jesus is omniscient. When he told Judas, you're going to betray me, and I know you're going to betray me, he also knew that where it would happen. Not just that it would happen, but where it would happen. So Jesus set everything up so the Father's will would be accomplished for the redemption of man. He sent Judas to speak to the priests and elders at that time so that he would be crucified at Passover. Jesus went to the garden where Judas would know he would be. The smart thing, if he were trying to avoid being arrested and killed, would have been to go somewhere else to pray, right? Somewhere else that Judas didn't know about. Find a new place. I mean, when you put your life in danger, like, say, for example, people who go into witness protection, what do? Change their name, hide them in a completely new location they've never been in their lives so that the people looking for them can't find them. Jesus doesn't do that here. Jesus isn't going into witness protection. Jesus goes straight to the place that he knows Judas will be able to find him, because he's setting it up so that he will be crucified on Passover as the ultimate sacrificial lamb. And so man could be redeemed. We also notice to whom Jesus says he'll be betrayed, right? Into the hand of sinners. Thank you. Into the hand of sinners. Now, these are the religious leaders of Judea. And because of their station, they are viewed as men of God. The people see them as men of God because they live these lives that appear to be sinless. They follow the rules to the letter. And that's the problem with what they're doing, is they're following the letter. They're following what God said without following it for the reasons God said. Their hearts are not in it. They're doing it so they can look like these important people, so that people will look at them and say, wow, look at that guy. You can tell he's a Pharisee because he never does anything wrong. He follows all the commandments. And that's the way it appeared, but it was not in their hearts, and that was the problem Jesus had with it. That's why Jesus couldn't accept it as true worship, because worship's in spirit and in truth, not in hypocrisy. So when you think about it, sinners is the term that the Sanhedrin, these chief priests that are on their way with their soldiers, sinners is the word they use to describe people they viewed as unworthy of God's love. That's their word. They would call people sinners. Think about the story Jesus tells about the Pharisee and the publican. What does the Pharisee call the publican? A sinner, right? The publican calls himself a sinner because he recognizes his own state in humility. But here Jesus calls them sinners. These men who thought they were following all the commandments, because physically they appeared to be following all the commandments. And Jesus calls them sinners. And calling them sinners to the disciples is a little bit of irony on Jesus' part. In spite of how they feel about themselves, these men are just as sinful as anyone else. There is no difference between the Pharisee and the publican, or the Pharisee and the prostitute, or the adulterer. There's no difference. Yes, exactly. Paul called himself the chief of sinners in humility. There's nothing wrong with us recognizing our state as a sinner. You know, you'll hear preachers in these big, well-attended churches, and they'll preach, oh, once you're saved, you're not a sinner anymore because Christ forgave your sin. You're a saint. You're a son of God. You're the child of the King. And that is true. Your sins have been forgiven. You are a saint, and you are a child of the King. But we are still sinners. We're saved sinners, but we still commit sins. These Pharisees acted like they didn't commit any sins. And so it's interesting that Jesus calls them sinners because he puts them in the same boat with everybody else who needs redemption, everybody else who needs Jesus. And it's also interesting when he calls them sinners, he's pointing out that they are exactly who he came to save, even though they're about to deliver him to the Romans for crucifixion. I mean, we haven't gotten to the cross, but you've read the story about the cross where Jesus says, forgive them, they know not what they do. He prayed for their forgiveness while they were crucifying him. And then Jesus tells his disciples, rise, let us be going. Behold, he is at hand that doth betray me. So we see Jesus is aware that Judas and those who would arrest him are on their way. They're coming. And the way this is phrased in English when Jesus says, let us be going, might seem like a suggestion to escape arrest, because he says, rise, let us be going. But the Greek verb suggests more of going into action, heading into the task at hand. He's not going away from the arrest. He's going towards the arrest. So even though he could have easily escaped, he knew they were coming. He's omniscient. He's like, oh, Judas is almost here. The human instinct would be to go, oh, Judas is almost here. Where's the closest tree? I'll climb it. I'll hide behind it. Everybody duck for cover so we don't get arrested. That would be the human intuition. Jesus chooses to remain because he has a mission. And that mission is to take the punishment of God's wrath in our place. Even though just a few minutes ago or an hour ago, he was praying, Lord, if there's any other way, please let this cup pass from me. And yet when it comes down to it, he faces it and does God's will. So we're going to move on in the story. We're going to read verses 47 through 56. So now Jesus knows Judas is coming. He says, rise, let us be going. Behold, he is at hand that doth betray me. And then starting in verse 47, and while he yet spake, lo, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now he that betrayed him gave them a sign, saying, whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he, hold him fast. And forthwith he came to Jesus and said, Hail, Master, and kissed him. And Jesus said unto him, "Friend, wherefore art thou come?" Then came they and laid hands on Jesus and took him. And behold, one of them which were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck a servant of the high priest's and smote off his ear. Then said Jesus unto him, "Put up again thy sword into his place, for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Thinkest thou that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then shall the scriptures be fulfilled? And thus it must be." In that same hour said Jesus to the multitudes, "Are ye come out as against a thief with swords and staves for to take me? I sat daily with you teaching in the temple, and ye laid no hold on me." But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. So we see here Judas arrives, and he has with him a multitude assigned to him by the Sanhedrin. And that's the priests and elders and the scribes. They were like a religious, governmental kind of council. And these soldiers are carrying swords and staves are basically clubs. So according to Jewish documents, the priests commanded the temple guard, which were Jewish peacekeeping soldiers. They were basically like local policemen. And during feasts like Passover, when there were many extra people in Jerusalem, the Romans would assign a detachment of their soldiers to the command of the Sanhedrin to help keep the peace. There's, what happens when there are a lot of people around? Something happens, right? People get into a scuffle, somebody bumps into another person, if there are a lot of people around, there might be some thievery and stuff like that. And there may be rioting, so the Romans, to keep the peace, would give a detachment to the priests to command. So, noting that there was a great multitude is not an exaggeration on Matthew's part. There would have been many temple guards and Roman soldiers there following Judas and the priests, and apparently their servants as well, to arrest Jesus. So apparently the Sanhedrin feared Jesus' power or the number of people who might be with him, since they sent so many well-armed men. They're trying to arrest one man. He's got 11 other guys with him, and they send a multitude with swords and clubs. They must have been expecting some kind of resistance. And like I said, whether it was just knowing Jesus' power or knowing there might be people with him, but either way, the show of force of sending all these men, Matthew doesn't even count them. He says a multitude. Now, Judas may have advised them to have so many men available to him out of fear as well. I mean, Judas had actually witnessed Jesus miraculously feed and heal people, command the storm, walk on water, raise the dead, and now he's about to face him and betray him. Imagine what must have been in his head and in his heart as he's approaching the garden, knowing that he's going to betray Jesus, knowing the power that Jesus holds, having witnessed the power Jesus holds. If I were going to betray someone that I had seen exert that much power, I'd want a lot of backup too. I mean, a lot of backup. And the funny thing is that backup was all pointless for two reasons, which we'll look at in a minute. Now, we know from the gospel according to John that Judas knew Jesus would be here because this was Jesus' prayer spot when he was in Jerusalem. He'd often go there to escape from the crowds and get some time alone with the Father. Now, he may have first taken the soldiers to the room where they celebrated Passover because that's the last place he saw Jesus. We don't know. It doesn't tell us here, but it doesn't tell us that he went straight to the garden either. But when he saw that Jesus wasn't in the room, he would have known exactly where to go after that. He would have known, cross Kidron, get to the garden, because that's where Jesus is going to be. I wonder how emboldened Judas felt with all these soldiers behind him as he kissed Jesus as the sign that he was the one to arrest. Or did Judas still tremble at the thought of what he was doing? And I wonder when the plan was hatched that Jesus would be betrayed by a kiss from Judas. Now we have to remember, these men would not necessarily have recognized Jesus. It was in the evening, it was dark, and he was among a bunch of other Galileans. And it's not like he was an Instagram influencer or a TikTok star. No mugshots, no wanted posters. Even in the Old West, at least they had sketches of people on the wall, right? He was there among a bunch of Galileans in the dark. They would not have known which one he was. He wouldn't have stood out. So this conversation may have happened at the time Judas agreed to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, because the idea was to arrest Jesus when it was less conspicuous. You have to remember, the Pharisees and the elders did not want to arrest Jesus at a time that would frustrate people, make them possibly revolt. They wanted to do it with a smaller crowd than what was normally hanging out around Jesus. They couldn't arrest him in front of people because they were afraid the people might revolt. And so I can imagine Judas coming up to the priests and going, "Hey, I can give you Jesus." And the priest's asking how, and he's like, "Well, I'll take you to him at night when no one else is around. And how will we know which of the Galileans he is?" And Judas says, "I'll just kiss him the same way I always do when I greet him, and he'll never suspect a thing." I can just picture that in my mind going on. Judas planning to betray Christ with a sign of affection. Because the word kiss here denotes an affectionately friendly kiss. The Greek word, it's not just a peck on the cheek. When I lived in Quebec, in Europe, men actually kiss men on the cheek, but we didn't do that. But men would kiss women, women would kiss men, and women kiss women on the cheek, both cheeks. But it's just a little peck, and you don't even touch the person's cheek. You just kind of like to the side. This was an affectionate, friendly kiss, is the Greek word. It wasn't just a peck on the cheek. It would have been with a hug and an actual kiss. And also, notice the words he uses right before kissing him. He says, "Hail, Master," which master is just another word for teacher here, but still showing an affection, showing there's a relationship there, a master or teacher and student relationship. So such words of respect and a kiss of love between close friends, just as he's hugging Jesus and all the while figuratively stabbing him in the back with his betrayal. It's just like Proverbs 27:6 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful." Because Judas had become his enemy at this point. He was betraying him. And even though Jesus has known it would happen, Jesus has known from the beginning that he would be betrayed. Even before he was born as a human being, he knew one day Judas would betray him. And yet, I don't think it hurts any less at that moment to have Judas kiss him, call him teacher, treat him as if he has affection for him, all while betraying him. "Hail, Master" are such empty, hypocritical words in this context. And yet we often do the same. We call Jesus Master and Lord, Yet we often turn around and continue doing our own thing, ignoring him and his will. And we think because we call him Lord, it's okay to act as if he's not. But I love Jesus' response here in verse 50, because he says, "Friend, wherefore art thou come?" First of all, he calls Judas friend, and that's the Greek word here. It's friend, phileo. Even while he's betraying him, Jesus knows. Even Jesus is omniscient. And again, even as a normal human, when your friend shows up and he's got a multitude of soldiers carrying swords and clubs, you kind of know there's something up, right? So Jesus knows that Judas is only singling him out by hugging and kissing him. And yet he calls him friend. Judas has become his enemy, and yet he still calls him friend. And he says, "Wherefore art thou come?" So unlike Judas' insincere kiss of friendship, I believe Jesus is very genuine here because he cannot lie or be deceitful. It would be totally out of character for Jesus here to just call him friend out of spite. Sometimes we'll call someone, "Yeah, you're my friend, sure." And really we mean, "You're not my friend." We're being sarcastic about it. Jesus here, I'm sure, was not being sarcastic. He still called Judas friend, considered Judas a friend. So Jesus, in his meekness, still shows affection for Judas in spite of what Judas is doing. And because Jesus has so much love for Judas, he gives him a chance to think about his actions and repent, because he's basically asking Judas, "Why are you here?" He's giving Judas the time, the opportunity to think about his actions, to think about how wrong it is. Because you'll remember back when Jesus prophesied that Judas would betray him, he said it has to be done for God's plan to be accomplished, but woe to the man who does it, right? It's something bad's going to happen to this person because his heart's not right. To be the one who was able to betray Jesus, his heart was not right. So it may seem like a paradox, but like I said, it had to be done, but he shouldn't have had to be the one to do it. And it's just amazing to me that as the soldiers start to arrest Jesus, he's still thinking of others over himself. He's thinking about Judas and his soul. And then as they take Jesus, one of the disciples, and we know from John's account that this disciple is Peter. Big surprise. Mr. Impulsive, right? He grabs his sword and he lops off the ear of the high priest's servant. Now, you may be asking why the disciples would be carrying swords. When you read Luke 22:36-38, you see that after Jesus tells Peter he would deny him 3 times in the upper room where they have the Passover, he then tells the disciples to carry swords. And I'm not going to read the whole passage, but he tells them, carry your wallet and your bag, and if you have a sword, bring it with you. If you don't have a sword, sell your robe and buy a sword. And they find 2 swords, and he says, "Okay, well, that's going to be fine. Just take those." And of course, the disciples apparently thought it was a good idea to let the craziest, most impulsive, volatile one of them carry one of those swords. Because Peter was the one carrying a sword. I don't think that was the smartest decision on their part, but Peter was very influential, and he probably campaigned to be one of the sword bearers. And even though Jesus is the one who told them to carry swords, when Peter actually uses his sword, Jesus reprimands him. Peter doesn't realize that in trying to help, but in doing it in his own power, he's just making more of a mess for Jesus to have to clean up. Because Luke tells us that Jesus actually picks up the ear and puts it back on the servant and heals him. So Peter's just making things worse, basically. Now, I believe Jesus had them carrying swords. This isn't in the Bible, but you would wonder why they would be carrying swords. Why did Jesus tell them to carry swords, and then when one of them goes to use it, he reprimands him? I think he was trying to teach them not to rely on their swords, not to rely on human power. When Peter brandished a sword and physically harmed one of Judas' party, he should have been immediately killed by the soldiers because he's pulling a weapon. What do the police do if someone looks like they're pulling a weapon? They fire, right? Because that's what they're trained to do. Do not give a person a chance to fire at you. And in the same way, when Peter brandished a weapon, he should have been killed by the soldiers. So when Jesus says, all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword, he's being very literal here. So it's actually a miracle Peter escaped with his life after that action. There may have even been angels holding back the soldiers in the same way they held back the hungry lions in the pit with Daniel. And speaking of angels, that's Jesus' next line in the story. He reprimands them and says, I don't have it written here. Thinkest thou that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? So he shows the disciples how much more important it is that he fulfill prophecy and become the ultimate sacrifice for our sin, when he basically tells them force is not the answer here. Peter thought he was doing something to save Jesus, but he was doing the wrong thing because Jesus has to go to the cross at this point. He could have prayed for 12 legions of angels and they would have rescued him. Now, we estimate that a Roman legion was 6,000 foot soldiers and 700 horsemen. And since Jesus mentions such a precise number as 12 legions, or actually more than 12 legions, he doesn't just say legions or many angels, he says more than 12 legions. We should take that literally because he's being precise and detailed. So imagine 80,400 angels, or more than that actually, more than 80,400 angels coming to Jesus' rescue. And then think of it in the context that in 2 Kings 19, one angel killed up to 185,000 soldiers in one night. That's the power of one angel. And God would have sent over 12 legions had Jesus asked for them. The same Jesus who an hour ago, roughly, was praying, if there's any way I can avoid this, can we do that? Can we find some other way? And yet when it comes down to it, he doesn't even try to find some other way. Fully submitted to God's will and God's plan of redemption for man. So Jesus is making a point here that while Peter's motives are justifiable, he's actually fighting against God's will. Jesus has been preparing his disciples for this very moment for quite a while. He's been telling them, they're going to come and take me and arrest me, bring me before the Sanhedrin. I'm going to be accused. They're going to turn me over to the Romans, and they will crucify me. He's told them this exact thing multiple times. Right. He's willing to take on this small army, and yet not willing to pray with Jesus for an hour. And later on, when he faces a little girl, he's going to deny Jesus. So in his passionate moment, in this big, just fully emotional moment, he's ready to act. But in the quiet things that really matter, he backs down. And again, that's like we are as Christians often, right? We're ready for the big emotional moment. We're ready for the big actions, big exploits. We're ready to do something for Jesus. But we forget that what Jesus wants is to do something through us. And it's easy to make these grand gestures to try to show Jesus how much he can trust us and rely on us. And what he really wants is for us to trust and rely on him. And then finally, after calling out Judas, then he calls out Peter and the other disciples. Pardon me, there are no tissues up front. Been trying to hold off, but my allergies. Okay. So he's called out Judas, he calls out Peter and the other disciples. Now he calls out the Sanhedrin and the soldiers. He starts by pointing out that they've come for an innocent man who, other than chasing vendors and money changers out of the temple a couple of times, has never shown any violent tendencies. And when he chased out the vendors, he was actually justified in doing that because they were the ones who were sinning and doing wrong. So there's nothing wrong with that. So by bringing this amount of men and weapons they would use against a hardened criminal, yet he was an innocent man who wasn't going to do anything to them. And then he points out their hypocrisy and cowardice. They've had plenty of opportunities to arrest him, and they could have done it even without Judas' betrayal, right? There were ways they could have done that. He's been teaching in front of people in the temple for a few days now. And it would have been obvious which one was Jesus because he would be the one standing in front of the group of people, or actually not standing, he would have been sitting. He would have been sitting in front of the group of people and teaching. But that would have meant arresting him in front of a crowd devoted to him. So the Jewish leaders feared the people would revolt and bring the Roman government down on them. So they come to him by night when it's just him and his disciples. So it's a much lower risk operation here. And there's next to no chance of causing a revolt because they have a huge army and they're just 12 men, Jesus and 11 of the disciples. And that's how it goes because the agents of darkness almost always operate in the night to hide their deeds. And then Jesus explains that this has all been prophesied in the Old Testament, and they're actually just acting according to God's plan, and they're fulfilling what must be done to redeem man to God. So they're just playing their part. They're still wrong for wanting to arrest an innocent man. Their motives are wrong. But God uses their wrong motives to accomplish his plan because he's sovereign. And then we see Jesus' prophecy from earlier that evening come true, when out of fear, all the disciples leave. And as far as we know, only Peter and John follow, and they do that from a ways back. They don't jump in and get themselves arrested. They probably wait till they've bound Jesus and they're walking out of the garden. They give him, I can't remember what it's called. I had it last night, but I didn't write it down. When you're tailing someone, you leave a gap. So imagine the heartbreak Jesus must be suffering here, as he has just been betrayed, and now all his other friends have fled. And it's not over. This is just the beginning, because he's about to face an unjust accusation and die on a cross to save you and me. Brother Jose, would you close us out in a word of prayer, please?